You are not the only one seeing videos like this from inside Iran for perhaps the first time. Demonstrators being shot at and taking cover in the city of Mashhad over 2 weeks ago. This during a 48-hour period that will go down in the history books.
London has always been the global stage for democracy, a city where Sir Winston Churchill once walked and where the right to protest is sacred. But this past weekend, something shifted on the streets that has left even veteran observers stunned. Amidst a sea of banners, flags of the Tehran regime, the very regime accused of butchering over 40,000 of its own citizens, were hoisted high. But it wasn't just the flags, it was the people carrying them. Most notably, individuals in NHS scrubs, appearing to cheer for an Ayatollah who has placed death sentences on activists living right here in the UK. How did the city of democracy become a platform for what activists are calling Nazi Islamism? Today, we go beyond the slogans to look at the unholy alliance forming on Briton streets.
The core of this story is a staggering moral paradox. We saw thousands marching for the sanctity of life in Gaza, yet at that very same rally, participants were seen chanting support for a regime in Iran that has turned its own cities into public morgues. Lily Mu, an Iranian activist living under a fatwa in London, describes the scene as a direct attack on those who have spent years protesting the atrocities of the IRGC. For those who fled the Hitler of the Middle East, seeing his image paraded past the Houses of Parliament is more than a protest. It is a haunting reminder that the very threats they fled have followed them across the ocean.
Perhaps the most painful nail in this story is the presence of medical professionals. The sight of NHS scrubs in a march that featured extremist gestures and support for designated armed factions has sparked a firestorm of criticism. In Iran, doctors are reportedly being tortured and raped for treating protesters. For UK-based medical staff to align themselves with the symbols of that regime is being called a disgrace to the oath. It raises a chilling question for the British public. When politics becomes this radicalised, does it stop at the hospital doors? Or is the social fabric of our institutions beginning to tear?
This isn't just about a march. It's about the feeling of safety in our capital. Activists like Lily Mu no longer feel safe in the city of democracy because the very groups that threaten her are now being given a platform. The comparison to the Nazi regime of the 1930s is a heavy one, but for those who witness the double-mindedness of these rallies, where human rights are demanded for one group while the murder of another is called nice, it is a comparison that feels increasingly real.
London stands at a crossroads. We are a nation that prides itself on tolerance, but we are now testing the limits of what a democracy can endure before it is hollowed out from the inside. We've seen the flags, we've heard the chants, and we've seen the scrubs. The curiosity of the viewer isn't just about what happened last weekend, it's about what happens next. Will the UK continue to monitor the situation while its streets are turned into ideological battlegrounds for foreign regimes? Or will there be a return to the values that once made London a sanctuary for the truly oppressed? The Nazi Islamism label is a sharp shot across the bow of the establishment. The question is, who is brave enough to answer it?
Come on, you pervert! Listen, mate, we're not here to cause a problem, yeah? We just want a word with you. Open the door, mate. We want to know if you want this why that girl at the age of 14 was groomed.
And you guys, every single one of you that are living here, is allowing this to go ahead under your nose.
There is a painful reality in Britain today that the authorities are desperate to keep under a lid. While the politicians in London talk about safeguarding and progress, a Bristol courtroom just provided a gut-wrenching reality check. This isn't an isolated case in the north. It is a nationwide scourge that has reached Somerset, London, and every corner of our country. But the real story today isn't just the crime, it's the abandonment of the survivors. while the Home Office has quietly blasted £19 million of your tax money to Pakistan to deal with their child abuse crisis. 250,000 survivors right here in Britain are being told to fade into the background. Keir Starmer has time for high-profile photo ops, but for the survivors of our own country's organised abuse networks, he hasn't found 5 minutes. Today, we expose the shadow effect and the moment the UK's social contract was officially shredded. Let's look at the data that Whitehall hopes you don't connect. The government recently authorised a £19 million package to Pakistan to address child sex exploitation. While we all hope for justice for children globally, the survivors in the UK are asking a devastating question. Why can't our own country sort its own children first? Survivor Ellie Reynolds, a woman of incredible courage, recently resigned from the government's own pal in protest. She isn't asking for a handout, she's asking for a listening ear and a support system that works. Instead, she and her colleagues have been met with half-hearted letters and zero commitment from the Prime Minister. Even more shocking is the role of the Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips. Reports suggest she has cancelled meetings with survivors for over a year. When those meant to protect you won't even look you in the eye, you aren't just a victim of a crime, you are a victim of the state. Why the wall of silence? Ellie calls it the shadow effect. The government was forced into a public inquiry by the Louise Casey Review, but survivors say the authorities are now trying to kick the can down the road. They are attempting to widen the remit of the inquiry, specifically to avoid pointing the finger at the identified demographic responsible for these crimes, specifically Muslim men of Pakistani heritage. By diluting the facts, the government is ensuring the problem remains unsolvable. They would rather see 250,000 British survivors fade than risk a difficult conversation about cultural integration and law enforcement failure. This isn't an administrative error, it is a systemic choice to prioritise political optics over the safety of our daughters. The government thinks that by sending money abroad and ignoring the roars of survivors at home, the headlines will eventually go away. They are wrong. You cannot charity wash the betrayal of an entire generation of girls. To the viewers who stayed, you see the disparity. You see the £19 million exit the country, while the Safeguarding Minister exits the room. My promise to you is to keep amplifying the voices of survivors like Ellie Reynolds, whom the authorities would rather silence. We confirm that the shadows are being lifted, and we sharply shot the truth. A state that refuses to protect its own children has forfeited its right to lead.
Up until July, over 25,000 people made the dangerous crossing on a small boat.
For the very first time, migrants arriving via small boat will be detained and returned to France in short order.
The first one-in, one-out deportation flight of 2026 has been mysteriously cancelled, abandoned without warning, without explanation, and without even the courtesy of a statement. The aircraft was meant to symbolise Sir Keir Starmer's promise to bring order back to Britain's borders. Instead, it became the very image of paralysis. And it forces a question Westminster cannot avoid. If the first flight fails in total silence, what confidence remains in the system that follows? Because this story does not begin with a successful launch. It begins with a grounded plane, a string of confused officers, and a government struggling to explain why its flagship policy stumbled before ever leaving the runway. The moment that was supposed to show Britain taking control has instead revealed just how fragile that control actually is. The flight was scheduled to depart just after dawn. A chartered aircraft stood waiting on a quiet runway. Teams had been briefed, documents were ready. Everything suggested this would be the carefully managed debut of Britain's new migration strategy. But at around 2:40 a.m, something shifted. A quiet message passed through the chain of command, and suddenly, everything stopped. Those on the ground describe an eerie freeze, the kind that only happens when an order comes from high above and no one dares question it. Security officers who had been stationed around the aircraft were told to stand down. Home Office liaisons who had already begun their checks were informed they were no longer needed, And the individuals meant to be transported to the airport simply never arrived. Their vehicles were redirected without explanation. What was meant to be the first demonstration of operational strength, instead, dissolved into quiet retreat. People close to the process say it felt as if someone in Whitehall pulled an emergency brake that no one had been expecting. And as the night wore on, confusion hardened into something far more damaging, the sense that this policy may not be functional at all. This one cancellation exposes something deeper, and to understand it, we must look at the political reality Starmer's government now faces. Britain is grappling with one of the most volatile migration environments in recent memory. More than 41,000 people crossed the Channel in 2025, a staggering number that has fed public frustration and triggered protests from Kent to the Midlands. Voters demanded action, demanded control, demanded something more convincing than speeches.
So I'm pleased to announce our agreement today on a groundbreaking returns pilot. For the very first time, migrants arriving via small boat will be detained and returned to France in short order. In exchange for every return, a different individual will be allowed to come here via a safe route, controlled and legal, subject to strict security checks, and only open to those who have not tried to enter the UK illegally.
Starmer responded with a pledge, a lawful, efficient, system-based solution. No theatrics, no Rwanda-style gambles, something he framed as grown-up governance. The one-in, one-out agreement with France became his chosen answer, a mechanism designed to remove irregular arrivals while accepting vetted refugees in return. And because of that, this first flight mattered. It was the government's chance to show the country that the new system was real, operational, and ready to scale. But instead of a symbol of competence, it has become a symbol of uncertainty. Inside Labour, MPs acknowledge privately that this moment could become politically toxic if migration numbers rise again in spring. Starmer has tied his credibility to delivery, and tonight, delivery is exactly what did not happen. The weight of expectation is enormous, and this one failed flight has now placed that weight squarely on Starmer's shoulders. By sunrise, journalists pressed for answers. Why was the flight cancelled? Was France unwilling to proceed? Was there a legal block? A procedural failure? Or is the system still not fully built? Yet throughout the morning, the Home Office said nothing of substance, offering only vague assurances that operational factors had been considered. Silence rarely reassures. In this case, it amplifies doubt. Starmer himself has framed the one-in, one-out deal as the antidote to years of chaos, insisting the country needs a credible, lawful alternative rather than empty promises. But credibility requires execution, and the absence of explanation leaves only speculation inside Parliament, inside the Home Office, and across a public already losing patience. Some insiders suggest incomplete legal paperwork stalled the operation. Others hint at a last-minute question raised by French officials. And there are those who simply say the Home Office was not ready. None of these possibilities inspire confidence. All of them point to a structure under strain. The silence from Number 10 only deepens the impression that this government may not be in full command of its own strategy. Britain's asylum infrastructure is buckling, and the cancellation of this flight has only thrown that reality into sharper relief. Detention sites are strained. Councils warn they cannot support additional placements. Processing backlogs remain overwhelming despite promises of reform, and legal challenges continue to interrupt removal efforts before they can be carried out. Against this backdrop, launching a complex bilateral returns mechanism requires flawless execution, the kind of execution Britain did not see this morning. Starmer's critics have wasted no time. Reform UK called the cancellation a national embarrassment. Conservative voices argue the government has no grip on the border. Even some Labour members admit privately that the optics are deeply problematic. This is more than a procedural misfire. It is a moment that threatens to define how the public sees Starmer's leadership. Steady and competent, as he presents himself, or cautious, overwhelmed and unable to deliver. And the question now is whether this was an isolated failure or the first crack in a policy not yet fit for purpose. This flight was supposed to be the turning point, the moment Britain signalled that a new era of rational, enforceable migration management had begun. Instead, it has revealed how fragile that new era may be. Nothing about this policy works if the flights do not. No agreement with France matters if the mechanisms collapse on day one. And no promise from the Prime Minister will matter if the public sees only grounded planes and unanswered questions. For voters watching from across the country, the symbolic damage is immense. A government that cannot launch its first flight leaves people wondering whether it can launch its 10th, its 50th, or its 100th. Every delay from this point forward will be judged through the lens of this failure. And Starmer, who campaigned on competence, now faces the unforgiving reality of proving it. Tonight's events have shifted the political landscape, and they have done so in silence. A deportation flight meant to showcase control instead exposed fragility. The runway stayed quiet. The plane never moved. And the government has yet to offer the country a single clear answer. And so the question echoing through Westminster tonight is not merely logistical, it is existential to Starmer's authority. If the Starmer government cannot execute Flight 1, how on earth will it deliver Flight 100?